When I was young, I wasn't given a lot of very useful advice about navigating sexual relationships. For example, at no point in time did anybody ever say to me, "You know, Marina, you're going to have a lot of mediocre sex. But when the right person comes along, he's going to totally rock your world. Keep looking for him." And nobody ever said to me, "Marina, you see all these horny teenage boys? That's going to be you when you're 30. So make sure that you have somebody who can keep up with you." That would have been useful advice. The one piece of advice I was given was, "Marina, no matter what you do, just don't give it away." I've taught hundreds of students the economics of sex over the years, and I can tell you that of women in the younger generation, this is exactly the lesson they get. And men and women in the next generation are repeatedly told that women really don't enjoy sex, certainly not as much as men do, and that the real purpose of sex is to meet men's needs. And many of my students believe that the reason why women participate in sex is because they're looking for something else, compensation for doing something that they don't really enjoy. As a society, we seem to be incapable of shedding this idea that men have sex for pleasure and women have sex for financial stability. I call this theory of female sexuality, "Your mother is a whore." We know she did it once. She certainly didn't enjoy it, because that would be gross. And hopefully she made your father pay. We're all very comfortable with the idea that your mother is a whore, far more comfortable with that idea than the idea that women might want to have sex just to satisfy their sexual desires. And that's because we firmly believe that women are naturally, biologically disinterested in sex. But that's not right, and it's time we evolved in our thinking. There are real costs to this belief that women are less sexual than men. And that is that women who act on their natural sexual impulses are treated as sexual deviants. They're shamed for behaving in a way that society thinks is contrary to their nature. Not only that, but openly sexual women are blamed for a whole host of societal problems. Everything from widespread unemployment to high rates of incarceration have been blamed on women who are not charging a high enough price for sex. The basic argument for this goes like this. There's only one reason why men are interested in being married, and that's because it gives them easy access to sex. Once men can get sex outside of marriage, then they stop doing things that they would do to attract a wife. Things like getting a job or staying out of prison. The solution is that women need to police the behavior of women who are freely supplying sex on the market, slut-shaming. That's how we restore the natural order in which no one has to imagine that their mother had sex for fun. This entirely false societal belief, this fact that women are less sexual than men, is used to control women's behavior. And every time we tell a girl, "Just don't give it away," we participate in that even when we mean well. So if it's not true that women are biologically less sexual than men, and there's mounting scientific evidence that they are not, why do we believe this is true? Okay, I'm an economist, and I'm an unapologetic economist, so of course I think there's an economic explanation for this. And what I believe is that women's, this belief is a remnant of an economic system that is now irrelevant. An economic system that created incentives for women to behave as if they were disinterested in sex, even when they were not. Okay. So to tell this economic story, we first have to talk about hose, not as in the bros before hose variety, but the hose that you use to till your garden. Throughout most of human history, you know that I have a limited time, right? Throughout most of human history, the hoe was the only farm tool that people had available to them. And the thing about hoes is that men and women are equally adept at using them. So throughout most of human history, husbands and wives worked together to feed their families. This all changed about 4,000 years ago with the invention of the plow. The thing about the plow is that while anybody can handle a hoe, right, it takes a real man to drive a plow, okay? You didn't know economics was this much fun, did you? So women, we're good at lots and lots of things, but let's face it, half of us can't even put in a light bulb if it's over our heads. We're certainly never going to be in a field driving a pair of oxen with a plow when we've got a man who's naturally bestowed with, upper body strength to do it instead. The invention of the plow was the beginning of the gender divide in agriculture. Once the plow was adopted, it made sense for men to specialize in the production of food and for women to take on the hard work of raising children and taking care of the home. Once the plow was adopted, two things happened. First of all, women became more dependent on men, and the spheres in which men and women spent their lives throughout the day became very separate. Okay, so what do ancient agricultural implements have to do with the fact that pretty much everyone thinks your mother is a whore? It's actually a simple story. The thing about men, and I don't like to generalize, but men, they're not really that crazy about other men coming in and impregnating their wives, okay? So once the plow was used, and we had these separate spheres so that men couldn't supervise their wives during the day, men started looking for wives that they believed would be sexually faithful. And once the plow was adopted and women became very dependent on men, they needed marriage for survival, and so they needed a way of signaling to men that they would be sexually faithful wives. The best way to do this is just to feign complete disinterest in sex altogether. The adoption of the plow led to women pretending that they're not interested in sex in order to marry. And once that happened, the idea that women were less sexual than men became a culturally accepted belief. Not because women are biologically less sexual than men, but because it was the optimal way for women to behave given the existing economic system. Okay, so you might be thinking, that's a good story, and I'd love to see you prove it, but I'm going to offer you up some evidence. In the 19th century, anthropologists roamed the planet exploring the lives of people who lived in pre-industrial societies at the time. And interestingly, given how pervasive our belief that women are less sexual than men, one of the issues that anthropologists explored was whether or not a particular society thought men were more sexual than women, or if women were more sexual than men. It turns out that in pre-industrial societies, the overwhelming majority, 76%, thought that men and women were equally sexual. Sure, 18% of them thought that men were more sexual than women, but the remaining 5% thought that women were more sexual than men. So much for the notion the superior sex drive of men is part of some biologically determined natural order for the human species. It gets even more interesting when we look at the way that people undertake production. If you look at societies in which only men participate in agriculture, the number of societies at which think that men are more sexual than women goes up to 33%. And among societies in which only women partake in agriculture, there isn't a single one that thinks that men are more sexual. Okay, so step forward through history now to 200 years ago. The age in which families are supporting themselves through agriculture ends at the beginning of the 19th century and in the Industrial Revolution. At the time, machines in factories are drawing families into the cities and workers into factories. Men, again, have the advantage in factory production because of their superior body strength. And so now we get an even bigger gender divide than we've had before. During the Industrial Revolution, women become more dependent on men than they ever had been in history before and ever have been since. The need for wives to signal that they're going to be sexually faithful paves the way for Victorian sexual values. Consider this. If you go back to pre-18th century Europe, at the time, if a woman couldn't have an orgasm, that was considered a form of sexual deviation. It was considered a sign of mental instability. By the time you get into the Industrial Revolution, the exact opposite is true. A woman having sexual desires is considered a form of mental illness so serious that it requires treatment by a physician. As an aside, this is when the vibrator is invented, because doctors at the time found the treatment boring and it made their hands hurt. For the past 35 years, women have been attending university at higher rates than men. That economic system that created incentives for women to act as if they're not interested in sex is not relevant for many women today. When you ask women who go to university how strong their sexual desires are, women who are university educated are more willing to openly express sexual desires than are women who didn't go to university. Maybe there's something about university that makes women horny. I don't know. But it's just as likely that women who are economically independent are just don't feel as inclined to suppress their natural sexual instincts. We've all heard the expression, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? I want you to consider the possibility that the cow doesn't want to sell her milk. I want you to consider the possibility that what the cow wants is a good milking every once in a while. I want you to consider the possibility that what the cow really wants is a farmer who can locate her udders. How is society served when we teach our daughters that their sex needs come secondary to that of men? And when we teach our daughters that the only proper way to have sex is when they're being paid for access to their bodies? And how is society served when we teach men that their needs are more important than the women they sleep with, and that buying a woman a few beers in a bar entitles them to ignore those needs altogether? Your mother is not a whore, neither is your daughter, and it's time we stop telling the next generation that she is. Thank you.